Today is Yom HaShoah, which in Israel is the Holocaust Day of Remembrance. It's kind of an overwhelming topic to think about, right? The Holocaust, World War II, the number of people who died is kind of staggering and overwhelming. It lasted 6 years. It took over almost a whole continent, almost 2 whole continents, right? It's a hard thing to wrap your head around and understand. And I think really the best way to know kind of what happened is to hear individual stories. My family is full of these individual stories. All of my grandparents on my father's side are Holocaust survivors. And so today I'm going to tell you one of these stories. So here on the right is my grandmother, Helene, and here on the left is her best friend, Anna, or I called her my great aunt. Families like this get a little complicated. We're not related by blood, but my grandparents and Anna and her husband kind of chose to be family together because there was no one else to be a family with after the war. So Anna was not actually born Anna. She was born Salomea Greenberg. That was her birth name in Krakow, Poland. Krakow is currently the second largest city in Poland. She was born on April 30th, 1917. She had an older sister, Paulina, and a younger sister, Francesca. Her parents owned a dairy business and a restaurant, so they were pretty middle class. It was a comfortable life. They lived in an apartment building that was mostly full of Jewish families. She went to school, she had friends, and life was pretty good in Poland at this point. Anna talks about not really noticing anti-Semitism in Poland until she turned 13, until she started going to high school. And across the street from her high school was a university. And she noticed that every fall there were protests, there were marches, because people thought there were too many Jewish students at the university, especially in the medical school. They wanted more Polish students and less Jewish students, which was the first time she really realized that a lot of Poles did not think of the Jews as Poles, right? They were not Polish students, they were Jewish students. There was a difference. But still, that was at the university. Anna was still in high school. So things were going pretty well until 1939. So here is a picture of Anna and her younger sister, Francesca, sometime before the war. But in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland. This kind of kicks off World War II, for those of you who haven't gotten there yet in your history classes this year. And Krakow was a very historical building. It had lots of historical city, had lots of old, beautiful buildings. And so the city government kind of agreed to capitulate, to surrender in hopes of avoiding bombing, to protect the city, the historical nature of the city. So the Germans came into Krakow, and pretty quickly things began to change for the Jews of Krakow. So a couple weeks in, the Germans surrounded the Jewish neighborhoods, and for about a week went building to building, apartment by apartment, and demanded everyone's valuables, your jewelry, any gold you might have, anything of value you were not allowed to own anymore as a Jew, so the Germans came and took it. Some people tried to hide things, but then there was always the chance you would be discovered hiding something. It was an uncertain time. No one was quite sure what was going to happen. But once the Germans had systematically gone through all the buildings, they kind of backed off a little bit. But they slowly kept adding restrictions. So Jews had to start wearing armbands with a star to mark them as Jewish. Their papers had to mark them as Jewish. It's a hard thing to understand, this idea of papers. It took me a long time to kind of wrap my brain around it. You know, nowadays when you get on an airplane, maybe you need to show your driver's license, but you don't need it to drive your car or to take a train or to leave your apartment building. But during the war, you could at any point be asked to show your papers. And if you were Jewish, your papers would say that in big letters on the top, and that was a pretty dangerous thing to possess. At one point, Anna was told to go to a doctor's office where they took measurements of her skull and her body. They were trying to prove that Jewish people's brains were smaller. Even from the beginning, there's this idea that Jewish people are lesser, and if they just look hard enough, they'll find physical proof of that fact. To stay in Krakow, you had to have a job. So Anna started working in her family's restaurant, but because her family was Jewish, they weren't allowed to own their restaurant anymore. So someone called a Troy handler came in. This was either a German or a Ukrainian, maybe a Pole, who would run the restaurant. And so Anna worked in the restaurant, kind of made herself useful. But she was the only member of her family who could find a job. Her older sister, Paulina, had already married. She had moved to another city with her husband. But Anna's parents and her younger sister were not able to find work, so they had to leave the city. Early on, you were still able to go to the country, and so that's where they went. They went to the country, and they tried to take as many belongings as they could because they didn't know how long they were going to be there. But even now, she was starting to notice a difference in how the Polish people were treating them. So, Mr. Patel.
And these were such painful things for myself because many of these people you thought were your friends. And little by little you had to experience this again and again, that there were no friends. You also heard these very negative remarks from people that lived around you and were not Jewish, that Jews thought that the streets belonged to them because the buildings belonged to them, but it isn't so. There was a certain satisfaction on the part of the Poles that live around.
So there is a lot of debate in modern times about how the Polish people acted during the war, but at least for the people that I know, the experience was mixed. But pretty quickly, you couldn't really trust anyone who knew you were Jewish. So the hope was to get false papers, a fake name and papers that wouldn't say you were Jewish on them. So Anna's family is in the countryside, her parents and her younger sister. In the beginning, Anna could still leave the city. She could take off her armband and get on the train and go and visit. And on one of these visits, her family was trying to get false papers. Her brother-in-law had come to the town to help with this process, and somehow the German police caught wind of it and came to the house where they were. Anna's father and sister were able to escape. They just kind of ran off into the fields. Anna was with her boyfriend at the time, Henry, and they just kind of said, look, we don't know what's going on. You can just leave us alone. But her brother-in-law was clearly the ringleader and was arrested and was never really heard from again. Anna's story is full of uncertainty. She knows almost nothing for sure about what happened to her family. Everything from this point on is what was told to her by other people. So the dates get kind of murky, the details get kind of murky. But later in the war, it was too hard to leave the city, so her family was in the countryside. Anna was still living in Krakow and working in this restaurant. And none of her family really made it past 1941. So the war started in 1939. By 1941, as far as she knows, all of her family was gone. Her father was hidden after this kind of false papers fiasco. They all had to go into hiding. So he had a ring that he had hidden. He was paying a man to hide him in his house with this ring. And as best we know, the neighbors got kind of jealous. Why are you making money off of this Jewish man? And so the neighbors turned in Anna's father. He was dragged to the police station, and that's the last that she knows of what happened to him. Her sister was also in hiding and was turned in by the person hiding her, right? It's a lot of trust to put in someone to hide you, and it was a long war. Things changed. So at some point, the person hiding her sister, Francesca, maybe got scared, maybe decided she just didn't want to anymore. But Francesca was turned in, taken to a jail in Krakow. Anna was actually able to see her sister in the jail in Krakow, but wasn't able to get her out of the jail. And then she was taken to Treblinka, which was an extermination camp. Anna's mother lived as a peddler for a time, so she kind of walked the streets and sold pots and pans and trinkets. But this was dangerous because if you were out in public, someone could recognize you, which is what happened. So Anna's mother was recognized as a Jew, denounced to the German soldiers in the street, and shot in the street. Anna heard all of these things later from other people, but basically by 1941 she was alone. She doesn't know what happened to her older sister. Her older sister had moved to Vilna with her husband. She'd had a son, but Anna doesn't really know what happened to her. Mr. Patel?
That when I came in 1945, I came to Krakow from Vienna to look for my family. I thought maybe there will be some, but there was no trace of anyone coming back. So I figured that she perished in Vilna with the other Jews who were exterminated there. She had a little child that was born during the war, and her husband. There was nobody left.
So Anna is alone in Krakow. As far as she knows, she is already the only person left of her family. And in 1941, March of 1941, the Germans created a ghetto in Krakow, which meant that all of the Jews had to live in a small area of the city. They built walls around it. They had guards at the gates. You couldn't move in and out freely. Anna lived in a room in an apartment, but again, you had to work if you wanted to stay in the ghetto. By this point, she was no longer able to work in the restaurant, so she got a job cleaning buildings outside of the ghetto, which turned out to be a pretty good gig because you could scrounge for food when you were cleaning these buildings and try and smuggle it back into the ghetto. Many stories of the ghetto focus on how hungry everyone was. There was just never enough food. It was a dangerous thing to smuggle food in. If you were caught, you could be killed. But, you know, if you could do it, you could help out your neighbors, you could help out the people who were living with you. After a while, she bought a sewing machine and began working in a factory owned by a man named Julius Madrich. You may not have heard of him, but you might have heard of Oskar Schindler, who the movie Schindler's List is based on, and it's a fairly similar story. Madrich had a factory, he employed a lot of Jews, and he made sure to keep employing those Jews to kind of protect them, to give the Germans a reason to keep them around. So she worked in this factory, and then in March of 1943, the Germans closed the ghetto. People who were not working were sent to extermination camps in other parts of Poland, but the people who still had a job were moved to a concentration camp called Plasnow. It was a work camp, so as long as you were working, you could stay, but it wasn't exactly an easy place to be. Parents were taken from their children were taken from them. It was uncertain every day what was going to happen to you. They would have to spend hours outside being counted, kind of anything to keep reminding the Jews that they were less than human, that they were not important, that they did not matter. That was kind of the Germans' goal. So she did still work in this factory. She was escorted to the factory by guards every day and escorted back to the camp every night because they were watched very closely to make sure they didn't escape. But Anna did manage to escape.
One day, I asked one of the Polish girls that were going through our room, they worked in the next room, if she would lend me her ID and I could walk with her. And she agreed that she would do that. I had to change my clothes because we had, by then they painted our clothes with yellow paint, sort of that we won't escape. Later on they had made those striped clothes. And I remember that one day she says, today I had to change my clothes, but there was this huge gate and there was a man with a big key and there was this Jewish policeman standing on the gate. I waited in another doorway waiting for this man to go into he was escorting a truck with materials, and I walked out with her. Just as he was opening the gate and I was walking, I heard his voice right behind me. If he had seen me, recognized, he would kill me there. It was because it was his life against mine. He actually received 50 lashes for my escape, but all these girls, they were also responsible for it. We were marching like in 5. They agreed that if I have the opportunity, I should go. I was so terrorized that when I walked with this girl to maybe a block away, I wanted to go back. I just didn't know what to do with myself. And she prevented me from doing it. I have no idea who that person was. I had no idea about her name or anything. I wish I did. And then I had a place to go, at least for a few nights. This boyfriend of mine.
Can we go back to the slides, please? So this is a picture from after the war, but Anna is still a very young girl. She's kind of innocent looking, which worked to her advantage from here on out. So she has managed to escape from this work camp, but now it's more uncertain. You have to not be recognized as Jewish. So again, she tried to get false papers. She had a boyfriend, Henry, who had false papers and was working in this a town in the southeastern part of Poland. And so Anna gets her first false name, Krishna Nowakowska. She wore a cross, she carried prayer books with her, she did everything she could to not seem Jewish. Because at any point, if someone said you were Jewish, that's kind of all it took. They could turn you in, and you could be sent to a concentration camp, you could be shot on site. You didn't really know what was going to happen to you. So she moves to this town in southeast Poland with her boyfriend Henry, who was a violinist. He also had false papers, and she had to get a job. She had to live with him. They had to come up with this story about why they were living together, but they weren't married. So she said she'd run away from home because her parents didn't approve of their relationship. And she got a job working at the railroad. She spoke a little German. So she would be the phone operator, and she would be in contact with kind of the spotters up in the tower who were watching for trains to come through. The perk of this job was you got a train pass, so you could travel with your train pass. You had to get a stamp every month to show that you were still working for the railroad. That's going to become a thing later. But even at this job, there was a woman who was suspicious, who said, you don't dress like you're from Krakow, you don't sound like you're from Krakow, you don't like to drink vodka like the rest of us do. So this woman kind of started to spread rumors. Luckily, it seems people didn't really believe those rumors, but Anna lived for almost a year under this constant fear of being discovered. She started having fainting spells. Eventually, she left the job at the railroad because of her kind of nerves, her fainting spells. It was a time of a lot of fear and uncertainty. In the spring of 1944, so about a year later, her boyfriend was arrested, not actually for being Jewish, but they suspected him of working with the resistance, with the underground. He was arrested and killed, but he was able to get word to Anna to get out of town. Everyone knew they'd been living together, so she needed to leave. And so she took her now expired train pass and got on the train and just had to hope that no one would check the back to see that she hadn't had a current stamp in a while. And she thinks because she was kind of young and helpless looking, people just kind of let her go. So she returned to Krakow with this expired train pass and with these false papers that are now connected to someone who's been arrested. So she needed new false papers. She had kind of a friend in the city of Krakow who let her stay with them for a while. And this friend of a friend, this is Henry, all the way on the left. It's another Henry. This is who would eventually become Anna's husband. Henry was in Vienna, but he had hidden some valuables in another small town in Poland. And by this point, false papers were very expensive. So Anna got back on the train with her expired train pass, went to this other small city, dug up these valuables, and then came back to Krakow with her expired train pass, sold them. She kept Henry's mother's watch for him, but sold everything else. Then sent a Polish woman in her place to go pick up these false papers and got her second false name, Anna Gromek. So this is where she became Anna. She kind of stuck with that for the rest of her life. With these new false papers in April of 1944, she was able to finally leave Poland and go to Vienna. Vienna was no picnic, but it wasn't Poland. There were a lot of foreign workers, especially Polish workers, coming to the city, so they had a whole system set up to assign you a job. Anna was assigned to be a maid for a German family. The husband was an officer who spent most of the last year of the war in Italy, but the wife and their 3 children lived in Vienna. Anna lived with them and kind of took care of the kids and did the dishes and the cleaning and the laundry. She was a terrible housewife, but luckily this German woman was worse and didn't really realize that she was bad at her job. Anna hated this family, hated them, but she still had to pretend to not be Jewish. She still had to be worried that someone would recognize her or just notice that she was different and turn her in. The Germans were still controlling Vienna at this point. But at least she had a steady job. Henry was there. He worked in a monastery. He was a gardener, but they could meet at night. And that's how they spent the last year of the war. In April of 1945, Vienna is liberated by the Russians, who are no picnic either. They were pretty violent. You had to kind of avoid the Russian soldiers. There was still very little food. There had been so much bombing that there wasn't running water, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure, but they kind of just moved into an empty house and started to build a life for themselves. Eventually, things kind of normalized. Anna and Henry got married in the embassy in Vienna. This is where they met my grandparents in Vienna. Kind of after the war, you went and registered with the Jewish agency to tell them you were still alive, to start to try and find information about your family. And so Anna and Henry were in line. My grandfather was in line. They met, became friends, and ended up together in America. In 1947, Anna and Henry came to the United States. This is a picture of Anna on the boat. On the way over, they came through Ellis Island. It was miserably hot in New York in the summer of 1947. It was miserably hot in Chicago in the summer of 1947, but my grandparents were already in Chicago. Anna and Henry were still in New York. They called up my grandfather and said, "It's hot here." And he said, "Oh, it's great in Chicago. Come on over." It worked out in the end. They lived together for a while until they started having children. They kind of raised the kids together. So this is kind of how they became my family, is that my dad grew up with their sons, and everyone just kind of became a family because they didn't have anyone else. But it was still hard for a really long time. Their oldest son is named Anthony. It was the most Catholic name they could come up with. On his birth certificate, it says that he is Catholic because Anna and Henry were so afraid of admitting that they were Jewish, and especially of labeling their children as Jewish, right? They'd spent so much time having to be afraid because of who they were, afraid that other people would find them out, and it took a very long time to let that go. Mr. Patel?
Made peace with this, that I am Jewish, even though through years, I remember that I worked, I couldn't bring this through my throat that I was Jewish. And you know, the first few years in this country, when I saw a policeman, I was looking at my arm, if I had my band on, there were all these incredible fears, nightmares, terrible, terrible nightmares. This, in the course of the years, it improved actually. Only occasionally. And every time I have these nightmares, it is, oh, why did I make my kids Jewish? They will have to go through the same thing. Made peace.
So here's the family fairly early on, Anna and Henry and their 2 sons. Anna died last year at the age of 101. So, you know, she had a good life. She made a life for herself. She and my grandmother both went to college. They went to night school to learn English. Then they went to community college. Then they went to college. And then they both went to social worker school. Anna was a social worker with the Cook County jail system and felt like she could kind of relate to people who were in trouble, who were scared, and was able to really enjoy her job. She had a family. So I tell you this story for a couple reasons. One, because it's important to remember that these were real people that these things happened to, right? It's very easy in class to just kind of hear numbers and places and not put faces with those names. But they were all real people. Everyone who was lost was related to someone, probably lots of someones. There are lots of people like Anna who lost everyone and kind of had to build a life for herself. But it's also a story of people being afraid of people and then people helping, right? There were people who helped Anna along the way, whether for money or because they knew each other before the war. Mostly it was people who knew them before the war who were able to say, these people are real, they're human, they're not just this other that everyone is trying to tell me they are. Obviously, this is an extreme story. It's a hard story to hear. It's a hard story to grow up kind of knowing this is where my family came from. But we have to pay attention to how we got to this place so that we don't get there again. We're not there yet, but the little things, the little ways we make people other, the little ways we think that they're less than us or different than us or we should be afraid of them, that's what we need to be vigilant about. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do today. Thank you.